Hi guys, tonight's story is about the woman who wore a beard for Queen Victoria. One of those wonderfully strange pieces of history you don't often hear about. If you like stories with a twist, please tap that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to know who is joining us from different corners of the world. So, lights down, maybe a fan on low for that cosy hum, and let's step together into this late night tale. The Bearded Lady's Testament being the true account of Mrs. Euphemia Blackwood, as set down in the year of our Lord 1897. The autumn rain falls upon my window as I set pen to paper, and I find myself a woman of 63 years, grey-haired and bent with the weight of secrets that have pressed upon my shoulders these 30 years past. The fire crackles in my modest sitting room in Bloomsbury, and the gaslight flickers as though the very spirits of the past are stirring to hear their tale told at last. You may wonder at the peculiar nature of what I am about to relate, and I confess that in the telling of it, I sometimes wonder myself whether these events truly transpired, or whether they were but the fevered imaginings of a younger woman caught up in the strange currents of our Queen's court. Yet the looking-glass does not lie, and when I pass my hand across my chin, smooth now these many years, I feel still the phantom sensation of what once grew there, coarse and dark as a gentleman's whiskers. I was not born to such distinction, if distinction it may be called. My name is Euphemia Blackwood, née Harrison, daughter to a Yorkshire wool merchant who possessed more ambition than fortune. It was the winter of 1847 when I first came to London, a girl of 13 with nothing to recommend her, save a keen eye for needlework and an unfortunate tendency toward what my mother called masculine features. A strong jaw, thick brows, and a constitution that seemed to favour the production of hair where ladies ought to remain smooth as porcelain. But I run ahead of myself, as old women are wont to do when the fire burns low, and memory becomes more vivid than the present moment. Let me begin where this strange tale truly commences, in the spring of 1864, when Her Majesty Queen Victoria still wore the black of mourning for her beloved Albert, and when the very air at court seemed thick with whispered conspiracies and half-glimpsed shadows. Chapter 1. The Summons. It was the 15th day of April, in the year of our Lord 1864, when the summons came that would alter the course of my existence as surely as the Thames alters its banks with each tide. I was then 30 years of age, employed as a seamstress in the establishment of Madame Fournier on Regent Street, a French woman who possessed the peculiar talent of making English ladies believe themselves capable of Parisian elegance. The morning had begun as any other. I had risen before dawn in my lodgings near Marylebone, broken my fast upon bread and tea, and made my way through the sooty London streets to take up my needle and thread. The season was well advanced, and we were much occupied with the preparation of mourning dress, for the Queen's grief had infected the entire nation, and black silk had become more precious than gold. I was bent over a particularly intricate piece of jet beadwork when the shop bell chimed with unusual insistence. Madame Fournier emerged from the back room, her face bearing that expression of mingled deference and calculation which she reserved for customers of the highest quality. Behind her came a figure that made my needle pause mid-stitch. The woman was perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in the deepest black, with a bearing that spoke of courts and carriages rather than counting-houses. Her gloves were of the finest kid leather, her bonnet trimmed with ribbons that had never known the touch of lesser hands. But it was her eyes that held me, grey as winter sky, and sharp as the blade of a well-honed knife. "I am Lady Pemberton," she announced, her voice carrying the particular accent of those who have never doubted their right to be heard. "I come on a matter of the utmost delicacy, concerning a position of service to Her Most Gracious Majesty." Madame Fournier practically genuflected, her French vowels becoming more pronounced as they always did when nobility entered her establishment. "Of course, my lady. How may we be of service?" But Lady Pemberton's gaze had already found me, and I felt exposed beneath it as though she could see through cloth and skin to the very workings of my heart. "You are Miss Harrison?" I set down my needle with hands that trembled only slightly. "I am, your ladyship." "I have heard remarkable things of your discretion, and of certain physical peculiarities which may prove advantageous in a delicate undertaking." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Her Majesty has need of a woman who can appear as a man when circumstances require it." The words struck me like cold water, yet I found my voice. "I fear I do not comprehend your meaning, my lady." Lady Pemberton moved closer, and I caught the scent of bergamot and something else, something sharp and metallic that I would later recognize as the smell of fear, though at the time I knew it not. "There are those who would do our sovereign harm," she said, so quietly that Madame Fournier, standing but 3 paces distant, could not have heard. "The recent troubles in Ireland, the Fenian demonstrations. There are whispers of plots, of plans that reach even into the sacred precincts of the palace itself." My heart began to beat with the irregular rhythm of a church bell in a storm. "And do you believe, my lady, that I might be of service in thwarting such designs?" "I believe," she said, fixing me with those winter grey eyes, "that a woman who could pass as a man might move through certain circles, observe certain behaviours, and report certain conversations that would otherwise remain hidden from loyal eyes." The shops seemed to grow smaller around us, the bolts of silk and the mannequins in their finery pressing closer, as though eager to hear what would be spoken next. I thought of my small room in Marylebone, of the endless succession of stitches and seams that stretched before me like a road leading nowhere, and I felt something stir within my breast that I had not known was sleeping. "What would be required of me?" I asked. Lady Pemberton reached into her reticule and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "First," she said, "you must come with me to a place where certain preparations can be made. There is a gentleman of my acquaintance, a theatrical person who understands the art of transformation. Under his tutelage, you will learn to walk as a man walks, to speak as a man speaks, to carry yourself with the bearing that society expects of the masculine sex." She paused, and I saw something flicker across her features. Pity, perhaps, or merely calculation. But these arts alone will not suffice. Nature herself must be enlisted in our cause. You will be provided with certain treatments, certain applications that will encourage the growth of facial hair. In short, Miss Harrison, you will grow a beard. The words hung in the air between us like incense, heavy and strange. I thought of my mother, dead these 5 years past, and wondered what she would make of such a proposition. I thought of the life I had known, the careful respectability of needle and thread, the small comforts of tea and firelight and Sunday service at St. Marylebone Parish Church. "And if I were to refuse?" I asked. "Then you will return to your stitching, and no word of this conversation will ever pass beyond these walls. But if you accept—" She opened the velvet pouch and showed me what lay within. Golden sovereigns, more than I had ever seen in one place. gleamed in the gaslight like captured stars. "You will be well compensated for your service to the crown, and you will have the satisfaction of knowing that you have played a part in preserving the safety of our beloved Queen." I looked at the gold, at Lady Pemberton's expectant face, at Madame Fournier, who had withdrawn to a respectful distance but whose ears were doubtless straining to catch every word. Through the shop window I could see the familiar bustle of Regent Street, the carriages and omnibuses, the gentlemen in their dark coats and the ladies in their crinolines, all of them moving through their appointed rounds like figures in a vast clockwork. When would this service commence? I heard myself ask, and knew, even as the words left my lips, that my fate was sealed. "Tomorrow morning," Lady Pemberton replied. "A carriage will call for you at 7 o'clock precisely. Bring nothing save what you wear. Everything else will be provided." She closed the velvet pouch and placed it in my hands, and I felt the weight of those golden coins like a physical thing, heavy with promise and peril in equal measure. "One final question, Miss Harrison. Are you a woman of strong nerves?" I thought of the nights I'd spent alone in my lodgings, listening to the sounds of the city, the cries of the watchman, the rattle of wheels over cobblestones, the distant laughter from the public houses. I thought of the dreams that sometimes came to me in the small hours, dreams of adventure and purpose beyond the narrow confines of my daily existence. "I believe I am, your ladyship." "Then we understand one another." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "Miss Harrison, you may find in the coming weeks that the line between truth and performance becomes somewhat blurred. I trust you will remember at all times where your true loyalty lies." And with that she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of bergamot and the feel of gold coins burning like coals in my palm. Madame Fournier approached with the careful steps of one walking upon ice. "Mon Dieu," she whispered, "what manner of service requires such unusual qualifications?" I looked at her, this woman who had employed me these 3 years past, who had trusted me with her finest work and her most demanding customers, and I felt the first bitter taste of deception upon my tongue. "I fear I am not at liberty to say, madame, but I must give notice of my employment. Today will be my final day in your service." Her face creased with concern. "But Euphemia, ma chère, are you certain this is wise? There is something about that lady, something that makes my old bones ache with foreboding." I pressed her hand gently, feeling the calluses that years of needlework had etched upon her fingers, so like my own. "I am certain of nothing, madame, but I am weary of certainty. Perhaps it is time for uncertainty to have its day." That evening, as I sat in my small room counting and recounting the golden sovereigns, I found myself before my looking-glass, studying my reflection with new eyes. The face that stared back at me was not beautiful by any conventional measure. The jaw too strong, the brows too heavy, the complexion too weathered by London's sooty air. But there was something there, something that might, with the proper encouragement, transform itself into something altogether different. I ran my fingers along my chin, feeling the slight roughness that I had always fought with pumice stone and careful shaving. What if, instead of battling this tendency, I were to embrace it? What if the very features that had marked me as unwomanly might serve to make me convincingly masculine? The fire burned low as I sat there, and in its dying light I fancied I could see the future spreading out before me like a map of unknown territories. There would be danger, that much was certain. Lady Pemberton's words about plots and conspiracies had not been spoken lightly, but there would also be purpose, adventure, the chance to serve my queen and country in a manner that no ordinary seamstress could ever hope to achieve. I thought of Her Majesty, alone in her mourning at Windsor or Osborne, surrounded by the shadows of memory and the weight of crown and sceptre, if there were indeed those who would do her harm. If dark forces were gathering like storm clouds beyond the palace walls, then perhaps even a woman such as myself might serve as a small bulwark against the tempest. As the clock struck midnight, I rose from my chair and began to pack what few belongings I would take with me into this new existence. My mother's Bible, worn smooth by years of handling, a lock of my father's hair, cut the day before he was laid to rest, the silver thimble that had been my grandmother's, and that bore the tiny dent from 1,000 stitches. These things I wrapped carefully in my shawl, and as I did so, I whispered a prayer to whatever powers might be listening, that I would prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in me, and that I would emerge from whatever trials lay ahead with my soul still my own. The dawn was grey and cold when the carriage arrived, its wheels muffled by the morning mist that rose from the Thames like the breath of sleeping giants. I descended from my lodgings with my small bundle, feeling as though I were leaving behind not merely a room and a life, but an entire self that would from this day forward exist only in memory. Lady Pemberton sat within, her face pale in the dim light, and as I settled myself upon the leather seat, she looked at me with an expression I could not quite fathom. "Are you prepared, Miss Harrison, to become someone else entirely?" I thought of the woman I'd been, Euphemia Harrison, seamstress, spinster, creature of habit and small dreams, and then I thought of the woman I might become, a player in great events, a servant of the crown, a keeper of secrets that could shake the very foundations of the realm. I am prepared, your ladyship. The carriage lurched into motion, carrying us through the awakening streets of London toward whatever strange destiny awaited. And as the familiar landmarks of my old life fell away behind us, Regent Street, Oxford Circus, the spires of the churches where I had worshipped, I felt a curious lightness, as though I were shedding not merely my past, but the very weight of being myself. Chapter 2. The Transformation. The carriage bore us through districts of London that I knew only by reputation, past the grand facades of Belgravia, where the wealthy kept their townhouses behind wrought iron railings, and into the labyrinthine streets of Chelsea, where artists and theatrical folk made their peculiar homes among ramshackle buildings that seemed to lean upon one another for support. Our destination proved to be a narrow house, wedged between a tobacconist's shop and an establishment that proclaimed itself to be Madame Zelda's Academy of Mystical Arts. The windows of our building were draped in heavy curtains, and a small brass plate beside the door bore the discreet inscription, H. Fitzwilliam, Theatrical Services. Lady Pemberton rang the bell with the particular authority of one accustomed to being answered promptly, and presently the door was opened by a man who seemed to have stepped from the pages of a penny dreadful. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with silver hair that curled dramatically about his collar, and eyes of such a piercing blue that they seemed to look straight through to one's very essence. His clothing was theatrical in the extreme, a velvet jacket of deep purple, a waistcoat embroidered with golden threads, and boots that gleamed with an almost supernatural lustre. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying the rounded tones of one trained to project to the furthest reaches of a theatre. "And this, I presume, is our fair Galatea, waiting to be transformed into masculine Pygmalion. Indeed, Mr. Fitzwilliam, may I present Miss Euphemia Harrison, lately in the employ of Madame Fournier, and soon to be someone else entirely. Fitzwilliam studied me with the clinical gaze of a sculptor examining a block of marble, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks under such scrutiny. His eyes lingered upon my jaw, my shoulders, the breadth of my hands, and I saw him nod slowly, as though confirming some private calculation. "Yes," he murmured. "Yes, this will serve admirably. The bone structure is excellent, quite masculine in its angularity. The height is suitable, the bearing already somewhat, shall we say, decided. Come, my dear Miss Harrison, let us begin your education in the art of being what you are not." He led us into a room that might have been a gentleman's study had it not been for the peculiar additions that marked it as something altogether more exotic. Mirrors lined the walls from floor to ceiling, creating an infinite regression of reflections that made me dizzy to contemplate. Mannequins stood about like silent sentinels, some dressed as fine gentlemen, others as working men, still others in uniforms that I recognized as belonging to various professions: a postman, a railway conductor, even a clergyman. "The art of transformation," Fitzwilliam began, settling himself into a chair upholstered in crimson velvet, "begins not with the body but with the mind. You must understand, Miss Harrison, that masculinity is as much a performance as any role upon the stage. The way a man walks, the manner in which he occupies space, the very rhythm of his breathing, all of these things must be learned and practiced until they become as natural as your own heartbeat." He rose and began to pace before the mirrors, his movements fluid and graceful despite his substantial frame. "Observe how I carry myself. The shoulders are held thus, not thrust back in military fashion, for that would be overdone, but settled with quiet confidence. The hands," he demonstrated, letting his arms hang naturally at his sides. "They do not fidget, do not seek occupation with needlework or the arrangement of skirts. They simply are." For the next hour he put me through a series of exercises that left me feeling as though I'd never properly inhabited my own body. I learned to walk with longer strides, to let my arms swing freely, to take up space without apology. I practiced sitting in chairs, not perched on the edge as ladies are taught, but settled fully, with legs spread in easy comfort. "The voice," Fitzwilliam declared when he was satisfied with my physical carriage, "is perhaps the most crucial element. A woman may wear masculine clothing, may swagger and stride with perfect authority, but if she speaks in the higher registers, the illusion is shattered in an instant." He had me repeat phrases, scaling down my natural pitch until I found a register that felt foreign in my throat, but rang with convincing masculine authority in the mirrored room. We worked on the cadence of speech, how men tend to speak in shorter sentences, with fewer qualifiers, with a bluntness that women are discouraged from employing. "Now," he said, when the morning was well advanced and I had begun to feel the strange pleasure of successful deception, "we come to the matter of your natural endowments." Lady Pemberton, who'd been observing our exercises with the detached interest of a general watching manoeuvres, stepped forward. "Mr. Fitzwilliam has developed certain preparations that will encourage the growth of facial hair. They are derived from theatrical makeup techniques, but enhanced with, shall we say, more permanent applications." Fitzwilliam disappeared into an adjoining room and returned with a small wooden box that he opened with something approaching reverence. Within, nested in silk padding, were several glass vials containing liquids of various colours and viscosities, along with brushes of different sizes and what appeared to be tiny glass droppers. These compounds, he explained, lifting one of the vials to the light, are based upon the preparation of stage whiskers and beards, but refined through extensive experimentation. When applied daily to the facial region, they stimulate the hair follicles to produce growth that is both convincing and relatively permanent. The liquid in the vial was dark brown, with an oily consistency that caught the light strangely. The scent that rose from it when he removed the stopper was sharp and medicinal, with undertones of something earthy and wild. There may be some discomfort in the early stages, Fitzwilliam continued, his tone becoming more clinical. The skin will become sensitive, perhaps irritated. You may experience sensations of itching or burning, but these effects will subside as your body accustoms itself to the treatment. He demonstrated the application, a careful brushing of the preparation across the lower face, following the natural line where a gentleman's whiskers would grow. The liquid felt cold against my skin at first, then began to warm, and within minutes I could feel a definite tingling sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. The process is gradual, Lady Pemberton explained. Within a week you should see the first fine hairs beginning to emerge. Within a month you will have the beginnings of a proper beard. The question now is one of identity. She produced a leather portfolio from her reticule and opened it to reveal several official-looking documents. You will no longer be Miss Euphemia Harrison. From this day forward, you are Mr. Edmund Blackwood, younger son of a Yorkshire wool merchant, lately come to London to seek his fortune in trade. I stared at the papers, a birth certificate, a letter of introduction from a fictional employer, even a small daguerreotype of a young man who bore a remarkable resemblance to what I might look like once the transformation was complete. The attention to detail was extraordinary, and I felt a shiver of both admiration and apprehension at the thoroughness of the deception. "But why Blackwood?" I asked. "Your mother's maiden name," Lady Pemberton replied smoothly. "It provides a connection to your true history, while establishing your new identity. Should anyone inquire into your background, the basic facts will bear scrutiny." The next several hours were devoted to the construction of my masculine wardrobe. Fitzwilliam possessed an extensive collection of gentlemen's clothing in various sizes and styles, and we worked together to assemble an outfit that would allow me to move freely in masculine society without attracting undue attention. The sensation of wearing trousers for the first time was extraordinary. The freedom of movement, the way the fabric allowed my legs to stride without the encumbrance of skirts and petticoats. The waistcoat fit snugly across my chest, effectively concealing the feminine curves beneath, while the jacket was cut to enhance the broadness of my shoulders. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger, a young man of perhaps 25 years, slightly built but with an intelligent countenance and an air of quiet determination. The effect was remarkable, and I found myself standing straighter, breathing differently, occupying the space around me with a confidence I had never before possessed. "Excellent," Fitzwilliam pronounced. "Now comes the true test. Can you maintain this persona beyond the safety of these walls?" Lady Pemberton consulted a gold watch that hung from a chain at her waist. "There is a coffee house in Fleet Street where gentlemen of various professions gather to read the newspapers and discuss the affairs of the day. Mr. Blackwood will take his luncheon there, observe the customs, and begin to accustom himself to moving in masculine society." The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As Fitzwilliam made final adjustments to my appearance, teaching me how to tie my necktie with the proper negligence, showing me the correct manner of wearing my hat, I felt myself becoming someone new, someone who might walk through London streets with the freedom that had been denied to Euphemia Harrison. "Remember," Lady Pemberton said as we prepared to depart, "you are not merely wearing a costume. You're becoming Edmund Blackwood in mind, body and spirit. Your very survival and the success of our mission depends upon the completeness of this transformation." The coffee house proved to be a revelation. I had never before entered such an establishment. They were, of course, the exclusive province of gentlemen, and I found myself in a world entirely different from anything I had previously known. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the aroma of roasted beans, while the walls were lined with newspapers from every corner of the empire. Men sat at small tables, reading, writing, engaging in animated discussions about politics, commerce, and the affairs of the day. I ordered coffee and took a seat near the window, attempting to appear absorbed in a copy of the Times while secretly observing the behaviour of the gentlemen around me. The way they summoned the serving boy with a casual gesture, the manner in which they spread their papers upon the table without regard for the convenience of others, the casual assumption of space and service that seemed to be their birthright. All of this I studied and memorised. "Terrible business, this Irish question," remarked a gentleman at the neighbouring table, addressing his companion over the rim of his coffee cup. "Mark my words, there'll be trouble before the year is out." His companion, a florid man with whiskers that would have done credit to a military officer, nodded gravely. "The Fenians grow bolder by the day. I heard tell that there was some sort of gathering in Clerkenwell just last week. Speeches about liberation and such nonsense." My attention sharpened, remembering Lady Pemberton's words about Irish troubles and plots against the Queen. I strained to catch every word of their conversation while maintaining the appearance of casual disinterest. "What manner of gathering?" the first gentleman inquired. "Oh, the usual inflammatory rhetoric, no doubt, but I'm told there were men present who are not merely talkers, men with, shall we say, more practical inclinations." They lowered their voices then, and I could catch no more of their conversation, but the implications were clear enough. If such discussions were taking place openly in coffee houses, what manner of darker consultations might be occurring in more private settings? I returned to my lodgings, for Lady Pemberton had secured new quarters for me in Bloomsbury, more appropriate to my assumed status as a young gentleman, with my head spinning from the day's revelations. The face in my looking-glass was beginning to show the first effects of Fitzwilliam's preparations, a definite darkening along my jawline, a roughening of the skin that spoke of hair beginning to push through. That evening, as I sat by my fire reading the newspapers, for I must now keep myself informed of political events in a manner that had never before concerned me, I found myself pondering the strange path that had brought me to this pass. 2 days ago I had been Euphemia Harrison, seamstress, a woman whose greatest adventure was the occasional omnibus ride to Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon. Now I was Edmund Blackwood, gentleman, potential spy, a creature of shadows and secrets whose very existence was a lie in service of a greater truth. Yet as I touched my face, feeling the unfamiliar roughness beneath my fingers, I wondered if perhaps this was not a lie at all, but rather the uncovering of some deeper truth about myself that had always existed, but had never been allowed expression. There was something liberating about walking through the world without the constant awareness of being watched, judged, constrained by the invisible bonds that society places upon women. A knock at my door interrupted these philosophical musings. I opened it to find a young boy, perhaps 12 years of age, holding a sealed envelope. "Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, and I nodded, still marvelling at how easily I had learned to answer to this new name. "Message from a lady, sir, said it was most urgent." The letter bore no signature, but I recognised Lady Pemberton's distinctive hand. "The time of preparation is ended. Tomorrow evening you will receive further instructions. Be ready to assume your true duties. The safety of the realm may depend upon your discretion and courage. Burn this message after reading." I held the paper to my candle flame and watched it curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash and smoke. Through my window I could see the lights of London stretching away in all directions, a vast constellation of human hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. Somewhere among those lights was Windsor Castle, where our Queen sat in mourning, unaware perhaps of the forces that gathered against her. And somewhere else among those lights were the plotters, the conspirators, the men who would dare to raise their hands against the sovereign. Tomorrow I would begin the work of hunting them through the maze of London's streets and coffee-houses, drawing-rooms and public meetings. I touched my face once more, feeling the promise of the beard that would complete my transformation, and whispered a prayer to the God of my fathers that I would prove equal to the task that lay before me. For I was no longer merely Euphemia Harrison, seamstress, nor even Edmund Blackwood, gentleman. I was become something new under heaven, a guardian angel in masculine guise, a protector wrapped in deception, a woman who would wear a man's face in service of her queen. The adventure had begun in earnest. Chapter 3. Into the Lion's Den. The beard came slowly as Fitzwilliam had promised, creeping across my face like ivy upon a garden wall. By the end of the first week there was a definite shadow along my jawline, not yet the full whiskers of a gentleman, but enough to convince at a casual glance. Each morning I would apply the mysterious preparation, watching my reflection change day by day, becoming ever more the man I pretended to be. It was during this period of gradual transformation that Lady Pemberton summoned me to my first true assignment. The message came as before through a street boy, this one bearing instructions to meet her at St. James's Park at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was to bring with me certain documents that had been provided, papers that established my fictional history as a wool trader, with connections to several Irish commercial houses. The day was grey and chill, with that particular London dampness that seems to seep through even the stoutest woolens. I found Lady Pemberton seated upon a bench near the ornamental water, feeding breadcrumbs to a family of ducks while maintaining the appearance of casual leisure. She was dressed in her customary black, but I noticed that her gloves were new and of particularly fine quality, a detail that spoke of recent and generous compensation. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, without looking up as I approached, using my assumed name with the ease of long practice. "You appear to be settling into your new circumstances admirably." I took my place beside her on the bench, conscious of how natural it now felt to sit with my legs spread slightly apart, my hands resting upon my knees in the manner I had observed among gentlemen. "The transformation proceeds as anticipated, my lady. I find that certain aspects of masculine behaviour come more readily than I had expected." She smiled at this, an expression that held more calculation than warmth. "Indeed, I have had reports of your activities, the coffee houses, the gentlemen's clubs where you've begun to establish your presence. You have shown admirable discretion in gathering information. It was true that I had spent the past week immersing myself in the world of London's commercial gentlemen, listening to conversations in the smoky atmospheres of coffee houses and private clubs, learning not merely the mannerisms of masculine society, but the concerns that occupied the minds of merchants and traders. The Irish question, as I had discovered, was a topic that arose with disturbing frequency. "There is unrest brewing," I said carefully, echoing the phrases I had heard repeated in various establishments. "Men speak of it in whispers, but the whispers are growing louder. Precisely why we have need of your services." Lady Pemberton tossed the last of her breadcrumbs to the eager ducks and turned to face me fully. "This evening you will attend a gathering, ostensibly a meeting of the London Commercial Association, but in reality something rather different. There are individuals present who bear watching, conversations that require careful attention." She provided me with an address in Suffolk, a district I knew primarily by reputation as being rather less respectable than the areas where I had previously conducted my observations. "You will present yourself as a wool trader, seeking new connections for Irish markets. Your documentation has been prepared to withstand scrutiny, but remember that your greatest protection lies in appearing to be precisely what you claim to be. No more, no less." "And what am I to observe at this gathering?" Her grey eyes grew harder, like winter clouds threatening snow. "There are those who would use legitimate commercial concerns as a mask for more sinister activities. Irish merchants, they claim to be, seeking expanded trade with England. But we have reason to believe that some among them are connected with elements that pose a threat to Her Majesty's person and government." The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Fenians?" I asked, using the term I had heard whispered with such dread in the coffee houses. "Perhaps, or perhaps something worse. Organised revolutionaries who cloak their activities in the respectable garb of commerce. Your task is to identify the leaders, to note who speaks with whom, to memorise faces and names, but above all to remain undetected." She pressed a small leather portfolio into my hands. "These are your commercial credentials. Study them carefully. Your fictional history must become as familiar to you as your own true past. And remember, Mr. Blackwood, that in this game we play, the penalty for discovery is not merely embarrassment." That evening, as I made my way across London Bridge toward the address Lady Pemberton had provided, I found myself acutely aware of every detail of my surroundings. The gaslight flickered yellow against the fog that rose from the Thames, creating pools of illumination separated by patches of impenetrable darkness. The sound of my boots upon the cobblestones seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the narrow walls of the streets through which I passed. The building that housed the London Commercial Association proved to be a nondescript structure wedged between a ship chandler's shop and the establishment that proclaimed itself to be Murphy's Fine Irish Provisions. A brass plate beside the door bore the association's name in dignified script, but the windows were heavily curtained, revealing nothing of what lay within. I paused at the threshold, conscious that I was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. Up until this moment, my activities had been those of mere observation, listening to conversations in public places, noting the concerns of legitimate businessmen. But tonight, I would enter a room where conspiracy might be brewing, where words spoken in confidence could shape the fate of the realm itself. A prayer formed upon my lips, not the formal phrases of the Book of Common Prayer, but something deeper and more personal, a plea to whatever powers watched over England and her Queen, that I might prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in me. Then I lifted my hand and knocked upon the door. It was opened by a man of perhaps 40 years, with the weathered face of one who had spent considerable time at sea. His accent when he spoke confirmed his Irish origins, though his manner was courteous enough. "Good evening to you. You'll be here for the association meeting?" "Indeed," I replied, affecting the slightly nervous manner of a young man entering unfamiliar company. "Edmund Blackwood, late of Yorkshire. I was given to understand that gentlemen in the Irish trade might find profitable connections here." His eyes studied my face with an intensity that made me grateful for Fitzwilliam's theatrical training. "Irish trade, you say? And what manner of goods might you be looking to move?" "Woolens primarily, though I have connections to suppliers of other Yorkshire manufactures. Cottons, linens, that manner of thing. My father's business has prospered through connections with Liverpool merchants, but we seek to expand our reach." He nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with my credentials. "Aye, there's good business to be had with the Irish markets, provided a man knows the right people to deal with. Come in then, Mr. Blackwood. You'll find kindred spirits within." The interior of the building was dimly lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows upon walls lined with maritime charts and commercial notices. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of porter, and I could hear the low murmur of masculine conversation from a room beyond. My guide led me through a narrow hallway decorated with prints of sailing ships and portraits of stern-faced gentlemen whom I took to be successful merchants of previous generations. "The association has been meeting here these past 5 years," he explained as we walked. "Founded by men who recognized that the Irish trade required special understanding, shall we say. Not all commerce follows the same rules, particularly when dealing with a population that has suffered under English policies." There was an edge to his voice when he spoke of English policies, and I filed this observation away for later consideration. We entered a large room that had clearly been arranged for the evening's gathering. Perhaps 30 chairs arranged in rough semicircles around a small raised platform, most of them already occupied by men of various ages and stations. The company was more diverse than I had expected. There were gentlemen in fine coats, who might have been at home in any London club, but also rougher men whose clothing spoke of warehouses and docks rather than counting houses. Some bore the unmistakable marks of Irish origin, the particular cast of features, the manner of speech that no amount of English education could entirely eliminate, while others appeared thoroughly English, born and bred. I took a seat toward the back of the room, positioning myself where I could observe the entire gathering while remaining relatively inconspicuous. As the evening progressed, what had begun as seemingly innocent commercial discussion gradually took on more ominous overtones. The chairman, a well-dressed gentleman with silver whiskers, who introduced himself as Mr. Cornelius O'Brien, spoke at length about the challenges facing Irish commerce under current government policies. His language was careful, couched in terms that would have raised no eyebrows in any legitimate business gathering. But gradually, as the evening wore on and Porter loosened tongues, the conversation began to drift into more dangerous waters. "The troubles in County Cork have disrupted our supply chains considerably," remarked a man seated near the front. "3 of our best agents have been, shall we say, detained by the constabulary on charges of sedition." "Aye," agreed another, "and the searches of our warehouses have become increasingly thorough. They seem to suspect that our legitimate goods conceal more controversial items." I felt my pulse quicken as the implications of these words became clear. These were not merely merchants discussing trade difficulties. They were conspirators discussing the practical challenges of smuggling. quite possibly of moving weapons or other contraband under the guise of commercial activity. Mr. O'Brien raised his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, we must remember that discretion is the watchword of our endeavours. There are those who would willingly misinterpret our legitimate commercial concerns as something more sinister." But even as he spoke these words of caution, his eyes swept the room with an intensity that suggested he was well aware of the true nature of their activities. When his gaze fell upon me, I forced myself to maintain the expression of polite interest that befitted a wool merchant seeking new connections. "Our friend Mr. Blackwood is new to our company," O'Brien continued, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. Perhaps he would care to share his perspective on the challenges facing Anglo-Irish commerce. It was a test, clearly, an opportunity for me to reveal myself through some inappropriate response or failure to understand the coded language they employed. I rose to my feet, conscious of the weight of their collective scrutiny, and drew upon everything I had learned in my weeks of preparation. "Gentlemen," I began, pitching my voice to carry the slight nervousness appropriate to a young man addressing his elders, "I confess that my experience in the Irish trade is limited, being newly come to London from Yorkshire. But I have observed that successful commerce requires not merely good products and fair prices, but also understanding between peoples. The Irish have suffered under policies that many would consider harsh, and it stands to reason that any businessman seeking their custom must approach them with sympathy for their situation." A murmur of approval rippled through the room, and I saw several men nod in agreement. I had struck the right note, expressing sympathy for Irish grievances without committing myself to any specific action or opinion. "Well said, young man," O'Brien declared. "It is precisely such understanding that forms the foundation of our association. We seek to bridge the gap between English commerce and Irish needs, to create connections that serve the interests of both peoples." But as he spoke, his eyes never left my face, and I sensed that my response, while acceptable, had not entirely satisfied his curiosity. I would need to tread very carefully in any future interactions with this group. The meeting continued for another hour, touching on various commercial matters that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but carried darker implications for those who understood the coded language being employed. Names were mentioned: Irish merchants who required special handling, English officials who were sympathetic to reasonable requests, locations where sensitive cargo could be stored without attracting undue attention. As the evening drew to a close, several gentlemen approached me with offers of future cooperation. I accepted their business cards and made appropriate noises about potential opportunities, all while carefully memorizing faces and committing names to memory. But it was as I was preparing to leave that the most significant encounter of the evening occurred. A man who had sat silently throughout the meeting approached me near the door. He was perhaps 35 years of age, with dark hair and penetrating green eyes, dressed in a manner that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Unlike the others, who bore the marks of their Irish origins openly, this man's accent was educated English, though I detected something beneath it that spoke of different loyalties. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Thomas Whitmore. I couldn't help but notice your comments this evening. They showed a maturity of understanding rare in one so young." "You are too kind, Mr. Whitmore. I seek merely to learn from my betters in matters of commerce." His smile was pleasant enough, but his eyes remained watchful. "Indeed? And what brings a Yorkshire wool merchant to seek Irish connections? Surely there are profitable markets closer to home." It was another test. more subtle than O'Brien's but no less pointed. I affected the slightly embarrassed manner of a young man admitting to personal motivations. To speak truthfully, sir, my father's business has always been conservative in its approach. Traditional English markets, traditional English methods. I believe there are opportunities to be found in expanding our horizons, particularly in serving populations that have been somewhat overlooked by other English merchants. Overlooked, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that is one way to describe it. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, are you familiar with the recent troubles in Ireland? The activities of certain revolutionary elements? The question hung in the air between us like incense, heavy with implications. How I answered would determine whether I was accepted deeper into their confidence or marked as a potential threat. I read the newspapers, of course, I said carefully. There seem to be those who believe their grievances justify extreme measures. As a man of commerce, I deplore anything that disrupts trade and peaceful relations between peoples. But what if peaceful relations prove impossible under current circumstances? What if the very structure of governance makes normal commerce difficult or impossible? I saw the trap he was laying, pushing me to express opinions that would reveal my true loyalties. I confess, Mr. Whitmore, that I am but a simple merchant's son. Political questions are beyond my understanding. I seek only to conduct honest trade that benefits all parties. He studied me for a long moment, and I held my breath, wondering if my careful neutrality would satisfy him or mark me as suspiciously evasive. Finally, he nodded and pressed a card into my hand. Perhaps we shall have occasion to speak again, Mr. Blackwood. I represent certain interests that are always seeking reliable connections with English merchants who understand the complexities of the Irish situation. As I walked back through the foggy streets toward my lodgings, I found myself turning the evening's events over in my mind like a jeweller examining a precious stone for flaws. I had gained entry to what appeared to be a genuine conspiracy, possibly connected to the Fenian movement that had been causing such concern to the authorities. I had names, faces, and enough information to suggest that these men were engaged in activities far more serious than legitimate commerce. Yet I had also placed myself in considerable danger. Thomas Whitmore's questions had been pointed, and his final comment about reliable connections suggested that they might have specific plans that required English assistance. If I were to maintain my position among them, I would likely be asked to participate in activities that could range from smuggling to outright treason. Back in my room, I sat before my looking glass and studied the face that stared back at me. The beard was coming along nicely now, no longer merely shadow, but definite whiskers that gave me an increasingly masculine appearance. But it was the eyes that held my attention, for they seemed to belong to someone I barely recognized. There were a hardness there, a watchfulness that had not existed in Euphemia Harrison's gentle gaze. I was changing, becoming something new under the pressure of my circumstances. The question that troubled me as I prepared for sleep was whether this transformation was merely skin deep, or whether Edmund Blackwood was becoming more real than the woman who had created him. A soft knock at my door interrupted these unsettling reflections. I opened it to find the same street boy who had delivered previous messages, this one bearing the now familiar sealed envelope. "From the lady, sir," he said, touching his cap respectfully. The message was brief. "Your first report is required. Tomorrow morning, Serpentine Bridge, 9 o'clock precisely. Come prepared to provide detailed intelligence regarding tonight's activities. The game grows more serious." As I burned the message and watched the flames consume Lady Pemberton's words, I reflected upon the strange path that had brought me to this moment. 3 weeks ago I had been a seamstress whose greatest concern was the proper alignment of beads upon a mourning dress. Now I was a spy, a creature of shadows and deception, walking a tightrope between loyalty to the crown and the growing complexity of my assumed identity. Tomorrow I would meet with Lady Pemberton and provide her with the intelligence I had gathered. But even as I contemplated this duty, I found myself wondering about the men I had met that evening. Were they truly dangerous revolutionaries plotting against the Queen? Or were they simply merchants frustrated by policies they saw as unjust? Was Thomas Whitmore a master conspirator, or merely a businessman seeking profitable connections? The lines between truth and performance, between loyalty and betrayal, were becoming increasingly blurred. And somewhere in the fog of deception that surrounded me, I sensed that darker forces were stirring, forces that would soon test not only my skill at maintaining my disguise, but the very foundations of my character as an Englishwoman and a subject of the crown. Outside my window, the great city of London settled into its nocturnal rhythm, and I wondered how many other souls like myself were walking through its streets tonight, carrying secrets that could shake the very pillars of the realm. The adventure that had begun with Lady Pemberton's summons to Madame Fournier's shop was deepening into something far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. Edmund Blackwood had work to do, and Euphemia Harrison, seamstress of Yorkshire, was becoming little more than a memory wrapped in the growing reality of beard and masculine bearing. The transformation was nearly complete. Chapter 4. The Deepening Game. Hyde Park in the early morning mist held a quality of otherworldly beauty that never failed to move me, even in my new masculine guise. The bare branches of the ancient oaks stretched like supplicating arms toward the grey October sky, while the Serpentine lay still as hammered pewter beneath its shroud of fog. I arrived at the appointed bridge some minutes before 9 o'clock, positioning myself where I could observe anyone approaching, while maintaining the appearance of a gentleman taking his constitutional exercise. Lady Pemberton materialized from the mist like a wraith, her black mourning dress making her nearly invisible until she was close enough to speak. She carried a small basket, as though she'd come to feed the waterfowl, but her bearing spoke of tension rather than leisurely park-going. "Mr. Blackwood," she said without preamble, "your first venture into the lion's den appears to have been successful. I trust you have information to share." I recounted the previous evening's events in careful detail, describing each man I had observed, repeating conversations as precisely as my memory would allow. Lady Pemberton listened with the focused attention of a confessor, occasionally asking for clarification, but more often simply absorbing the intelligence I provided. When I described my encounter with Thomas Whitmore, her expression grew particularly grave. "You did well to avoid committing yourself to any specific position. This Whitmore bears watching. The combination of English education and Irish sympathies often produces the most dangerous sort of revolutionary. You believe him to be connected with the Fenian movement. I believe him to be connected with something potentially more dangerous than the Fenians. The Brotherhood has many faces, Mr. Blackwood, and not all of them are immediately recognizable as threatening." She paused to scatter breadcrumbs for the ducks that had gathered, hopefully, around our feet. "There have been whispers of a more sophisticated organization, one that operates within the very heart of English society, using legitimate commercial and social connections to mask activities that could threaten the stability of the realm itself." The implications of her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning dampness. And you believe that last evening's gathering was connected to such an organisation. I believe that you have gained entry to the outer circles of something that reaches much higher than a simple commercial association. The question now is whether you have the courage and skill to penetrate deeper into their confidence. She reached into her basket and withdrew what appeared to be a gentleman's calling card case, pressing it into my hands. Your next assignment will require considerable delicacy. There is to be a soirée this Saturday evening at the home of Mrs. Millicent Ashford in Belgravia, a lady of impeccable reputation, whose drawing room is frequented by politicians, military officers, and members of the diplomatic corps. I am to attend a society gathering. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. My experience of such events was limited to what I had observed while delivering finished garments to Madame Fournier's wealthy customers. You are to attend in the character of a young gentleman of good family seeking to establish himself in London society. Mrs. Ashford has a weakness for what she calls promising young men, and your credentials as the son of a successful Yorkshire merchant will serve as adequate introduction. But your true purpose will be to observe certain guests who are expected to attend. She provided me with a list of names that I committed to memory, a curious mixture of titled gentlemen, foreign attachés, and individuals whose connections were less immediately apparent. Several of these men were present at the Suffolk meeting in different guises. If they are indeed what we suspect them to be, they will use Mrs. Ashford's gathering to conduct business that would be impossible in more public settings. But surely such men would recognise me from the previous evening. Lady Pemberton smiled, and for the first time since our acquaintance began, there was genuine warmth in the expression. That, my dear Mr. Blackwood, is where the true artistry of your transformation will be tested. Between now and Saturday evening, you will complete your metamorphosis. The beard that now grows upon your face will be properly shaped and groomed. Your wardrobe will be enhanced with garments suitable for the finest drawing rooms, and you will receive intensive instruction in the social graces required of a gentleman moving in the highest circles. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that left me feeling as though I were being rebuilt from the ground upward. Fitzwilliam supervised the grooming of my beard with the precision of a master sculptor, shaping the whiskers that had grown upon my face into a style that transformed my entire appearance. Where the rough growth of previous weeks had suggested a tradesman or clerk, the carefully barbered results spoke of breeding and education. "Remarkable," he murmured, as he applied the final touches with his silver scissors. "The bone structure that seemed merely adequate for a working man's disguise proves admirably suited to patrician refinement. You appear every inch the younger son of good family." New clothes followed, garments of a quality I had never before worn, let alone owned. The evening dress coat fitted my transformed figure perfectly, its dark fabric catching the light with the subtle sheen that mark the finest woolens. The waistcoat was of white silk, the shirt of linen so fine it seemed to glow in the gaslight. When I looked in Fitzwilliam's mirrors, I saw a stranger who might indeed have stepped from the portrait gallery of any great house, but the most intensive training concerned not my appearance but my behaviour. I spent hours practising the intricate dance of Victorian social intercourse, the proper manner of introduction, the delicate art of conversation that conveyed intelligence without appearing pedantic, the careful navigation of topics that might be discussed in mixed company versus those reserved for masculine society alone. "Remember," Lady Pemberton instructed during one of these sessions, "you are not merely Edmund Blackwood, the wool merchant's son. Tonight you are Edmund Blackwood, the gentleman, educated, well-travelled, comfortable in the highest society. Your father's commercial success has provided you with opportunities that mere trade alone could never offer. Saturday evening found me standing before the imposing facade of Mrs. Ashford's Belgravia mansion, my invitation held in fingers that trembled only slightly despite my growing confidence. The house blazed with light from every window, and the sound of music and conversation drifted into the October night like incense from some elaborate ritual. A footman in full livery took my hat and gloves, while a butler whose bearing suggested he might have managed the household of a duke examined my card with the careful attention due to any gentleman unknown to the establishment. Satisfied with my credentials, he announced me to the assembled company with a voice that carried the authority of long training. Mr. Edmund Blackwood of Yorkshire. The drawing room was a symphony of gaslight and silk, Persian carpets and hothouse flowers, the cream of London society arranged in elegant tableaux throughout the spacious chambers. Ladies in evening dress that spoke of Worth and other fashionable couturiers conversed with gentlemen whose decorations and bearing mark them as members of Parliament, military officers, and diplomatic personnel of the highest rank. Mrs. Ashford herself proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, possessed of that particular beauty that comes not from youth, but from the intelligent deployment of wealth and social position. Her greeting was warm without being familiar, interested without being intrusive. "Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasure to welcome a new face to our little gathering. I understand you're lately come from Yorkshire. How refreshing to meet a gentleman who understands that true breeding may be found beyond the confines of London society." I murmured the appropriate pleasantries while scanning the room for faces I had memorised from Lady Pemberton's intelligence. There, near the fireplace, engaged in animated conversation with a gentleman whose uniform marked him as a senior naval officer, was Thomas Whitmore, looking every inch the prosperous English gentleman. His appearance had been subtly altered since our previous encounter. His hair was dressed differently, his whiskers trimmed to a more fashionable style, and his entire bearing suggested social position considerably higher than that of a mere Irish merchant. As if sensing my observation, he glanced in my direction, and for a moment our eyes met across the crowded room. There was no recognition in his gaze. The transformation that Fitzwilliam had wrought was indeed complete, but there was interest, the natural curiosity of one gentleman observing another new arrival. "I see you have noticed Mr. Whitworth," Mrs. Ashford observed, following my glance. "A charming gentleman, though somewhat mysterious about his background. He claims connections to the diplomatic service, but one sometimes wonders." She left the sentence delicately unfinished, in the manner of hostesses who collect interesting people as others might collect fine porcelain. Whitworth, not Whitmore as he had styled himself at the Suffolk meeting. The discrepancy was significant, suggesting that I was not the only person present who operated under multiple identities. I filed this observation away while allowing Mrs. Ashford to guide me through the ritual of introduction to her other guests. The evening proved to be a masterclass in the art of social espionage. Moving through the elegantly appointed rooms, I found myself in conversation with individuals whose names appeared regularly in the better newspapers, whose decisions shaped the policies of empire. Yet gradually, as the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues, I began to detect undercurrents that suggested not all the evening's business was as innocent as it appeared. A conversation between two gentlemen near the card-room concerned recent developments in Dublin that seemed to go beyond mere political gossip. A cluster of men on the terrace discussed supply arrangements with a specificity that suggested knowledge of more than legitimate commerce. and always moving through these conversations like a master musician conducting an orchestra, was the man who called himself Whitworth, connecting disparate groups, facilitating introductions, ensuring that certain individuals found opportunity for private conversation. It was past midnight when the evening's most significant encounter occurred. I had withdrawn to the library, a magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed to glow like jewels in the gaslight, seeking a moment of respite from the intensity of maintaining my social performance. I was examining a particularly fine edition of Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France when a voice spoke behind me. "An interesting choice for evening reading, Mr. Blackwood. Are you a student of revolutionary philosophy?" I turned to find Whitworth approaching, 2 glasses of brandy in his hands. His manner was relaxed, conversational, but I sensed the same careful attention that had marked our previous encounter. "I find it instructive to understand the arguments of those who would overturn established order," I replied, accepting the brandy with appropriate gratitude. Burke's warnings about the dangers of abstract idealism seem particularly relevant in our current circumstances. Indeed, though one might argue that Burke himself was a revolutionary of sorts, merely one who preferred evolution to sudden transformation. Whitworth settled himself in a leather chair beside the fireplace, gesturing for me to join him. "Tell me, what brings a Yorkshire gentleman to Mrs. Ashford's salon? Surely London society offers little of immediate interest to a man concerned with wool and commerce." Once again, I found myself being tested, probed for information that might reveal my true purposes. "My father believes that success in modern commerce requires more than mere knowledge of manufacturing and markets," I said, falling back on the carefully constructed background that Lady Pemberton had provided. "He has sent me to London to acquire what he calls social connections, relationships that might prove valuable in expanding our business into new territories." "Ah, new territories. And which territories might those be?" The question seemed casual enough, but I sensed deeper implications. "Ireland presents considerable opportunities, I believe, for merchants who approach the market with proper understanding of local circumstances." Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Ireland. Approval, perhaps, or merely interest. "Indeed, Ireland offers many opportunities for the right sort of businessman, though one must be careful to work with reliable partners, men who understand that certain ventures require discretion." The conversation continued for perhaps 20 minutes, dancing around topics that neither of us wished to address directly. Whitworth spoke of his own business interests, imports from the continent, connections with Irish commercial houses, the challenges of conducting trade in politically unsettled circumstances. I responded with carefully neutral observations, playing the role of an intelligent young man seeking to understand the complexities of commercial relationships. But beneath the polite surface of our conversation, I sensed a deeper assessment taking place. Whitworth was evaluating me just as I was studying him, seeking to determine whether I might be useful to his purposes, whatever those purposes might be. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to take their leave, Whitworth approached me once more near the entrance hall. "I have enjoyed our conversation tremendously, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps you might be interested in attending a small gathering I'm hosting next Tuesday evening. Nothing formal, merely a few gentlemen with Irish commercial interests discussing opportunities for mutual benefit." The invitation was precisely what I had hoped for. Entry to what was presumably a more intimate circle of conspirators. Yet I was careful not to appear overly eager. "That would be most interesting, Mr. Whitworth. I confess I am still learning the intricacies of London business society." He pressed a card into my hand, different from the one he had given me at the Suffolk meeting, bearing an address in Mayfair rather than the commercial district where our previous encounter had taken place. Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock, the conversation may touch upon topics of considerable sensitivity. I trust I may rely upon your discretion. Of course. As my hansom cab carried me through the empty streets toward my lodgings, I reflected upon the strange duality of my existence. In the space of a single evening, I had moved from the rough masculine company of Irish revolutionaries to the refined atmosphere of London's higher society, and in both contexts I had encountered the same man, operating under different names and personas. The realization that Thomas Whitmore and the gentleman known to Mrs. Ashford's circle as Whitworth were the same individual suggested that the conspiracy I was investigating reached much higher into the ranks of English society than anyone had suspected. Here was a man who could move with equal ease among dock workers and diplomats, who possessed the resources to maintain multiple identities and the connections to gain entry to the most exclusive social circles. But what troubled me most as I prepared for sleep was not the scope of the conspiracy I was uncovering, but the growing complexity of my own deceptions. Tonight, I had been tested not merely as a spy seeking to gather intelligence, but as a potential recruit to whatever cause these men served. The invitation to Tuesday's gathering suggested that I had passed their initial scrutiny, that they were prepared to trust me with information of considerable sensitivity. Yet how far could I allow this recruitment to proceed without compromising my true mission? And what would happen when they inevitably asked me to move beyond mere observation to active participation in their schemes? These questions haunted my dreams that night, mixing with images of bearded faces in gaslit drawing rooms, of whispered conversations and the persistent sense that I was walking a tightrope stretched above an abyss whose depths I could not fathom. The game was deepening, and I was no longer certain whether I was the hunter or the hunted. Chapter 5. The Queen's Sleep. Tuesday evening's gathering proved to be held in a townhouse of considerable elegance, its Mayfair address speaking of wealth and respectability that seemed far removed from the revolutionary activities I had begun to suspect. The building's Georgian facade was perfectly maintained, its brass fittings gleaming in the gaslight, its windows dressed with curtains that suggested taste and substantial means. Whitworth, I had resolved to think of him by this name in his current incarnation, received me in a study that might have belonged to any gentleman of leisure. The walls were lined with books that appeared to have been actually read, while Persian rugs covered floors of polished oak. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and decanters of what appeared to be excellent spirits stood ready upon a sideboard of mahogany that glowed like dark honey. Punctual as well as discreet, he observed with apparent approval as he poured measures of whisky into crystal glasses, valuable qualities in a potential business partner. The other guests arrived within the next quarter hour, and I found myself in company that was both familiar and surprising. O'Brien from the Suffolk meeting was present, though dressed now in evening clothes that transformed him from dockside merchant to gentleman of means. There were two other men I recognised from Mrs. Ashford's soiree, a Mr. Davidson who had been introduced as having interests in shipping, and Colonel Hartwell, a military gentleman whose conversation had suggested intimate knowledge of Irish affairs. But it was the final guest who caused my pulse to quicken with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sir Reginald Blackthorne was a man whose name appeared regularly in the Times, a member of Parliament with close connections to the Irish office, a gentleman whose political influence was matched only by his reputation for absolute loyalty to Crown and Constitution. "Gentlemen," Whitworth announced when we were all assembled, "I believe we may speak freely among ourselves. Mr. Blackwood comes to us with excellent credentials and a genuine interest in Irish affairs. Sir Reginald's presence should assure you all that our discussions this evening operate under the highest authority." The implications of this statement struck me like a physical blow. If Sir Reginald's presence indicated official sanction, then either the conspiracy I thought I was investigating was actually a legitimate government operation, or the corruption reached into the very heart of Her Majesty's administration. "The situation in Ireland grows more delicate by the day," Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being heard in the highest councils of state. "The Fenian movement has been successfully disrupted through conventional means, but intelligence suggests that more sophisticated organizations are emerging to take its place." He paused to sip his whiskey, his eyes moving around the circle of faces with the careful attention of a man who understood the value of information. "These new groups have learned from the failures of their predecessors. Rather than relying on popular uprising or dramatic gestures, they seek to achieve their aims through infiltration, corruption, and the systematic undermining of English authority." Colonel Hartwell leaned forward in his chair. "Our agents in Dublin report increasing sophistication in their methods. Document forgery, coded communications, the establishment of seemingly legitimate commercial enterprises to mask the movement of funds and personnel." "Which brings us," Whitworth interjected, "to the reason for this evening's gathering. We have received intelligence suggesting that these groups are planning something significantly more ambitious than previous efforts. Something that would strike at the very heart of English authority in Ireland, and possibly beyond." The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of carriage wheels upon the street outside. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather, sensing that I was about to hear information that would test both my courage and my loyalty in ways I had never imagined. "They seek," Sir Reginald said quietly, "to remove the source of English authority itself. Intelligence indicates planning for what they term the final solution to the Irish question, an attempt upon the person of Her Most Gracious Majesty." The words hung in the air like a curse, and I felt the blood drain from my face. An attempt upon the Queen, the very crime that Lady Pemberton had suggested might be brewing, but spoken of now with such specificity that it could no longer be dismissed as vague speculation. "When?" O'Brien asked, his Irish accent more pronounced than I had previously noticed. "Soon," Whitworth replied, "perhaps within the fortnight. Our sources suggest that the attempt will be made during Her Majesty's next public appearance, the opening of the new wing of the South Kensington Museum, scheduled for the first week of November." My mind raced as I tried to process the implications. If these men were indeed loyal servants of the Crown, why were they discussing such information in what appeared to be a private gathering? And if they were conspirators themselves, how had they gained access to intelligence that should have been available only to the highest levels of government? "The question," Colonel Hartwell continued, "is how to respond to this threat. Conventional security measures may prove inadequate given the sophistication of the planning we've observed." "Indeed," Sir Reginald agreed, "which is why we've developed what might be termed an unconventional response. Mr. Whitworth, perhaps you would explain our proposal?" Whitworth rose and moved to the fireplace, his bearing suggesting a man about to reveal information of the utmost significance. "Gentlemen, we propose to prevent this attempt not through increased security or the arrest of the conspirators, actions that would merely cause them to postpone their plans, but through a more direct intervention." The euphemistic language could not disguise the implications of his words. I felt my heart begin to race as I realized that I was listening to the planning of what could only be described as a counter-conspiracy, one that apparently enjoyed official sanction. The intelligence we have received includes the identities of the key organizers, he continued. 3 men whose removal would effectively decapitate the conspiracy and ensure Her Majesty's safety. Removal? I heard myself ask, though I dreaded the answer. Sir Reginald's gaze fixed upon me with uncomfortable intensity. Mr. Blackwood, I trust you understand that we speak here of matters of the highest national security. When the safety of the Crown is threatened, extraordinary measures may be justified. The room seemed to grow smaller around me as the full implications became clear. These men were planning what could only be termed executions, carried out without trial, without legal authority beyond their claimed loyalty to the Crown. I had stumbled into something far more complex and morally ambiguous than a simple investigation of Irish revolutionaries. I understand, Sir Reginald, I managed, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. The safety of Her Majesty must be paramount. Precisely. Whitworth returned to his seat, apparently satisfied with my response. Now, as to the practical arrangements. The 3 individuals in question are currently in London, meeting under the guise of commercial negotiations. They believe themselves secure, unaware that their communications have been intercepted and their plans discovered. He provided names and addresses that I committed to memory with the mechanical precision of long training. But even as I absorbed this information, my mind was wrestling with questions that seemed to have no clear answers. Was I witnessing the workings of a legitimate government operation so secret that it required the appearance of private conspiracy? Or had I discovered a group of individuals who had taken it upon themselves to act as judge, jury, and executioner in service of what they believed to be the national interest? Your role, Mr. Blackwood, O'Brien said, addressing me directly, would be to provide confirmation of the target's identities and current locations. Your commercial background and Irish connections make you ideally suited to approach them without arousing suspicion. And after I've provided this confirmation, I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. The matter will be handled by others, Colonel Hartwell replied. Your involvement would end with the intelligence gathering. Clean hands, as it were. The evening continued for another hour with detailed discussion of timing, methods, and the arrangements that would need to be made to ensure that the removal of the 3 Irish conspirators appeared to be the result of internal feuding rather than English intervention. I participated in these discussions with what I hoped was appropriate enthusiasm, while my mind struggled to comprehend the true nature of the task before me. When at last the meeting adjourned, I stepped out into the cool London night, the gas lamps casting their pale light upon the wet cobblestones. My thoughts were a tangle of conflicting loyalties and uneasy questions. Was I in truth serving the Crown, or merely aiding a cabal that had set itself above the law in the name of loyalty? The list of names they had given me seemed to burn against my chest, though it lay folded in the inner pocket of my coat. Somewhere in the warren of London streets, 3 men walked unsuspecting of the fate that now loomed over them. I lit a cigarette with unsteady fingers, inhaling deeply in the hope that the smoke might steady my nerves. Above the rooftops, the dome of St. Paul's loomed dark against the cloudy sky, a silent witness to the intrigues and shadows that had become my world. Tomorrow I would begin the work they had set me, confirming identities, tracing movements, ensuring that the noose of unseen justice, or injustice, tightened without a whisper. But as I walked back toward my lodgings, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that each step forward was also a step deeper into a darkness from which there might be no return.